We will control the vertical.
Welcome to this episode of Anthologic, the TV anthology podcast. I'm your host, Mark. Anthologic is a podcast dedicated to exploring the good, the bad, and the odd of horror, sci-fi, and mystery suspense anthology series on TV. Now, tonight's show we're going to be covering. I just want to explain a bit about how I pick the order of these shows as I go. As I've explained on previous episodes, I'm going to be doing a rotation of The Outer Limits, Twilight Zone, and Night Gallery on a frequent rotation. Every other week I'll be covering one of those episodes. So the idea is every 6 weeks, or 6 episodes I should say, you'll get an Outer Limits episode. Same for Twilight Zone, same for Night Gallery. But in the intermediate ones, I want to be picking from a fairly random set of anthology shows where I've managed to acquire. I've got a big stack of Blu-rays. Some of this is on streaming as well. I've identified just over 60 other shows to pick from. And what I do is I pick randomly. I've got a 60-sided dice, can you believe it? And I roll it, and then whatever that number is, I pick that show and I air it. And the only exceptions to that, if it's a planned show, if I've got a co-host coming on and I want to sort of plan a show ahead, that'll be the exception to that rule. But so that means I could get anything on these intermediate weeks from various shows that I've picked, episode ones, or at least the first episode of shows that I've managed to track down. So that's how this one was picked. Fear Itself is the series in question, picked entirely randomly. Now this one was a horror sort of anthology series that was shot in Canada, Alberta, Canada. And it began airing on the 5th of June 2008 on NBC on Thursday nights at 10 o'clock. Now, this is considered kind of an uncredited season 3 of Masters of Horror. The reason for that is it shares several of the same creative elements or people. It's created by Mick Garris, who did create Masters of Horror. Mick Garris is quite an interesting creative force. He was instrumental in the TV miniseries of Stephen King's The Stand, a similar TV miniseries of The Shining. He's probably most well known for being involved in Masters of Horror, but he's also on a website that shows short videos released on a frequent basis, which I really enjoy and I consume, which is called Trailers from Hell. It's basically various directors and filmmakers and film creative types commenting on films they like, the trailers of films they like. They're only 3 or 4 minutes. They're really interesting. Mick Garris does a lot of them. So I would recommend that to you, and Trailers from Hell. In addition, the producers of Masters of Horror were also the producers of this show. So you can kind of see why this is called like an unofficial third seasons of Masters of Horror. And it does kind of have the same feels to it. So yeah, I could see that. Unfortunately, it didn't have a happy run. It aired, its first 8 episodes aired, but then it was put in hiatus because of the 2008 Summer Olympics came on. And it turned out once the Olympics were over, they didn't bring the show back. There wasn't any announced from NBC. They didn't say what was going on. They didn't continue the series. Now, this was a 13-episode run, so they aired the first 8 and then proceeded not to air the remaining 5. And didn't comment on it for some time, and finally commented in March 2009 that it wasn't going to air the rest for whatever reason. I haven't been able to dig out the reasons for that decision, unfortunately. But from the feeling I get from this first episode, it wasn't because of creative ability or the juice. That this did deliver. This episode did deliver. So as far as I'm concerned, this is looks like a pretty good stand-up series from the first episode, the appearance of the first episode. However, this show was released in 2009 on DVD, so it is available, and I have to say I really enjoyed episode 1 and would recommend it. I'm going to try to avoid spoilers about this episode. as best I can, but I want to give you the feels and sort of convince you that perhaps it's something that is worth digging out and visiting. So, Season 1, Episode 1 is called The Sacrifice. This was directed by Brett Eisner, written by Mick Garris, I believe. Now, the writing credit is actually Mick Garris and Dale Howison, but it does look that this story was based on a short story by Dale Howison, which was called The Lost Herd. Mick Garris... but while they're both credited, I have a feeling Mick Garris actually wrote the screenplay for this. The cinematography, which was rather nice, was Attila Zalay. Now, the series starts looking very good. Men driving down like a deserted road with lots of potholes in a snowland, basically, in the countryside, all alone. And they're kind of inferring they're up to something suspicious because they basically say, we're going this way because we don't want cops stopping us. If we stick to empty roads, we'll be fine. So there's something going on. And we do find out later that they're carrying a horde of guns. The series looked good. The episode looked very good. Had a dramatic premise. One of the members of the four men was severely injured, and they basically they drive over something in the road that sort of wrecks their engine, so they can't go on any further. This man looks like they need to get him to a hospital, and like they're talking about they can't really take him to an hospital. There's that kind of talk, and they see like a building, a structure. Across the snow, and they drag him. They've got a boat, and they drag him in a boat, the wounded man, to this structure, which looks like an old-fashioned fort. And these women are there. Well, they go in unannounced. There's a radio going on. They hear a radio, and then they encounter a woman there. And it turns out there's a few women there. There's 3, in fact. And they offer to help. One of them says, "This man's dying. We need to help him." And the story unfolds at this point. I'm going to reveal very little more at this point. However, I have to say, they obviously, in a good TV tradition, something kind of horrific happens and shocking happens. What looks like just before the first, what would be the advert break, about 13-14 minutes in, which kind of ratchets up the tension. The feel of this film is kind of... it reminded me a little of the Ginger Snaps prequel movie, sort of old-timey. Though this is set in modern times. This wooden fort they're in, it's got an old-fashioned look to it. And the women have clothes which have an old-fashioned look. So it's like, what's going on here? Interesting. And they actually take the injured man to the infirmary, and there's an older man in there who's kind of suffering but not speaking, but they're tending to him too, it would appear. They call him the Reverend, so there's something about that. But the shocking thing we see just before the first advert break is they're tending to this man with medicine, but they get out a needle and thread, presumably to sew up this chest wound that he's got. But the girl proceeds to sew up his mouth. There you go. I'm not going to tell you any more than that. But it was quite a shocker. And so it goes on. Really well directed, well acted, looks very nice. The script is solid, makes sense, not goofy. There's some really nice cinematics. There's one point where there's apparently someone hung up. There's animals hung up in like an outside barn, skinned and sort of or dead, but just left to hang. But we see among them a man hung up too, who isn't dead, but it's kind of a nice piece of imagery. I quite like that. The whole vibe of it, as I say, is kind of a Ginger Snaps prequel, mixed a bit with something like The Keep. There was also, because this was set in snow and it was cold and dark, it kind of reminded me a bit of 30 Days of Night as well. And I'm not going to say much more than that. The circumstances, who is the evil presence or the monster or whatever you want it, is kind of, you think it's one thing and it swaps and stuff like that. So there's all sorts of fun stuff going on. I really enjoyed this episode, and I urge you to go dig it out. I did kind of post in another Facebook group, TV Terror, which a very good Facebook group that deals with sort of horrific TV, often movies, but other sort of horror TV. I posted in there about, did anyone have any thoughts on this series? Has anyone caught it? And I got a little feedback there. I got from Sean Cloran. I like this series. It had a cool DVD collection case too, so it's probably still available. It does look quite cool. And then from JP Andrika, it was a nice short-lived anthology that played on NBC. Yep, it certainly was. And we also get Shah Swartz Tigner saying they watched it when it was on TV. Now, I think it's aired in the UK on Channel 5, which no one ever watches in this country, so I never caught it on that. And then there was a comment from Nick Poblocki, who mentions there was he says the one with Doug Jones is good. So there's one with Doug Jones apparently. So yeah, cool. That wasn't this one though. And then Kyle Chamberlain says a little more about this. He says, this was kind of an unofficial third season of Masters Horror. It was decent, but because it was on network TV, it was a little neutered compared to Masters. Didn't find it new. This episode didn't feel particularly neutered. It was kind of gory in places and shocking and visceral as well. I like the turns it took. It was kept you guessing a lot of the way through, so there was something about it, but it didn't shy away from the graphic horror, so there is that to it. And then Michael Mueller said, saw 4 episodes, brackets, no idea how many there were. He says the werewolf one was okay, the body swap one fell flat on the ending, the wedding one was quite good, the PO one was the best in my own. So none of these are this episode, so there's a few for me to look forward to. And then the last piece of feedback was Dennis Takas. I'm sorry if I butcher this, by the way. Dennis Takasako. I vaguely recall being pleased that the show was on at the time, possibly due to the paucity of horror programming in general. Less so now with the proliferation of cable networks and alternative streaming media. Yeah, there's loads of horror around now, so yeah. Maybe there was a lot less in 2009, right? So yeah, recommend this show. I am looking forward to seeing more of these, and I'll get to it at some point after all the others I want to cover. But yeah, this is a solid. I recommend it. So I'm going to say goodbye and leave you a final question. Is anybody out there?
We now return control of your television set to you until next week at this same time, when the control voice will take you to